Welcome students. Today we are going to take up the revision session for our third chapter, that is economic reform since 1991. Now, after 1991, the policies that the government had adopted to bring about development had undergone a change. So far, during the period of 1950 to 1990, the objective was to help our economy to build up self-reliance or self-sufficiency. But now it was high time that we gear up to face up the international competitiveness by increasing our efficiency and speeding our process of growth. The economic reforms are popularly known as the LPG policies, or the liberalization, privatization, and globalization policies that were adopted since 1991. Now, what were the factors that led to the adoption of the new economic policy or the economic reforms since 1991 had undergone a change in their approach? The following factors were responsible. Number one, fall in the foreign exchange reserves, continuously rising imports and decreasing in the volume of exports. 2. Adverse balance of payment. Number 3. Mounting fiscal deficit, as the government's expenditure was rapidly rising as compared to its revenue. Rise in prices. Inflation was another problem being faced, where the general price level of goods and services were rising due to excessive demand and low supply. Failure of public enterprises. The public sector enterprises failed to meet the objectives of growth and industrial development single-handedly. Thus, there was a need that private sector should supplement its effort. Gulf crisis. International hike in the price of crude oil. High rate of deficit financing. Year after year, continuously, the public expenditure continued to remain higher than the public revenue. Next, collapse of the Soviet bloc. The new economic policy was introduced in 1991. This was basically aiming to increase the productiveness and the profitability of the economy so as to face the international competitiveness and improve our standards of production. Because it was high time that we now start facing the global challenges and increase our production standards. The policy measures adopted under the new economic policy basically had two objectives. Number one, to bring about stabilization in the economy. And number two, structural changes or structural adjustments. Stabilization. As the economy was struck by inflation, it was urgent to put a check on the rapidly rising prices, falling foreign exchange reserve, and the adverse balance of payment needed to be controlled. The next aim of these policies were to bring about an increase in the efficiency of the economy and improve the competitiveness of our industry. so as to face the international challenges. This could be only done by giving more space and freedom of operation to the private sector so as to enhance or improve its standards of production. So, structural objective was to bring about a change in the approach in order to increase the efficiency and productiveness of our industries. The new economic policy could be discussed in short as the three sets of measures, that is, liberalization, privatization, and globalization measures that the economy had adopted to bring about an increase in industrial production and improve the competitiveness of the economy. Now we are going to take up these LPG policies in detail. We'll take up liberalization first. Liberalization means removing all unnecessary control and restrictions like licensing, having a policy of protection through quotas, permits, duties, tariffs. The liberalization policy basically aimed at relaxing all kinds of restrictions imposed on movement of goods, services, and people across the borders, and to give more space to the private sector. The basic reasons why liberalization was adopted. Number one, to decrease the burden of debt on the country. The continuous rising public debt. The public expenditure was being funded by excessive public borrowing that had to be checked. Number two, expansion of market. Now it was important for us to expand our global markets and carry out production to trade in international market. 3. To increase competitiveness amongst domestic industries, to improve the standard of production of our domestic production units. Number 4. Encourage export and import of goods and services. So these were the basic reasons why globalization was adopted. Now, how liberalization helped in bringing about economic reform. Liberalization and its impact can be discussed in terms of the reform measures that were adopted with regard to different sectors. Liberalization in the industrial sector. Number 1. Liberalization or relaxing of rules and regulation and giving more freedom in industrial sector was through abolition of industrial licensing, contraction of public sector, freedom to import capital goods. Financial sector reform. Liberalization was introduced in the financial sector by reducing the statutory liquidity ratio, the cash reserve ratios, and encouraging more lending operations by the banks. Change in the role of RBI. The strict control and restrictions that were imposed by the RBI on its banks, particularly the public sector commercial banks, were now relaxed. RBI was more into a role of facilitating its goals rather than having a control on their operations and deciding the do's and don'ts. Deregulation of interest rates. Now, the private sector banks, the public sector banks, the nationalized banks were given more space in adjusting their interest rates. Fiscal reforms. These reforms basically pertain to the reform measures related to public expenditure and public revenue. Next, foreign exchange reforms. Foreign exchange reforms were basically brought about to control the volume of export, import, depletion of the foreign exchange reserves, devaluation, revaluation of rupees so as to determine the foreign exchange rate and increase our exports and bring about a decline in our imports. Fifth, trade and investment reforms. Encouraging MNCs to set up their production units, buy assets, import capital in countries beyond their home country, so as to interlink production activities across the world. The next set of measures refers to the measures or the policies related to privatization. Privatization basically means transfer of ownership, control, and management into the hands of private entrepreneurs. The decision-making powers and the ownership rights were now being transferred to private entrepreneurs. Initially, the objective was to give a major responsibility to the government to bring about economic development by accelerating the industrial growth. But now the approach had undergone a change. Privatization was encouraged through contraction of public sector, that means keeping the public sector or the role of the government confined, abolish the ownership of government in management of public enterprises, increasing that is to increase the equity share of the private sector, public-private partnership. And lastly, sale of shares of public enterprises or disinvestment, where assets are transferred from the public sector into the hands of private entrepreneur. So that is all about privatization and its introduction. Next class will deal with the objectives of privatization. Till then, take care and be safe. Thank you.